The train rolled slowly along the iron tracks, its wheels groaning as if tired of carrying the weight of men and machines through endless fields and villages. Outside the windows stretched the England of 1847, gray skies pressing low over rolling hills, smoke from small chimneys curling into the damp air, and the soft cries of children heard only when the train passed close enough to their homes. It was a world both old and changing. The steam engine itself was still something new, something people trusted only half-heartedly, a beast of fire and iron that could carry you faster than a horse yet felt too dangerous, too strange. Still, the trains moved, carrying workers, merchants, and families across the country, stitching distant towns together in a way the world had never seen before. Inside one of the carriages, the scene looked calm at first. A boy, no older than 14, sat alone near the window. His head rested against the wooden frame, and his eyelids grew heavy as the rhythm of the train lulled him into sleep. To the others in the carriage, scattered men in long coats, a tired mother holding her restless child. He was just another passenger, unremarkable in his silence. None of them knew that his journey would end in a place no one could have imagined, that when he woke, the world around him would no longer feel familiar. The year itself carried its own unease. England in 1847 was not a gentle country. It was a land of soot and factories, where men worked until their backs bent, and children were expected to labor almost as soon as they could walk. Cities swelled with smoke and filth, while the countryside emptied as the poor sought wages they could not find in their villages. The rich lived in tall houses behind gates, watching the world below them grow harder by the day. The poor struggled to eat, to sleep in warmth, to live past 30. The hunger was especial. L.Y. Sharp that year. The great famine in Ireland had spilled into English streets, filling them with wandering souls, gaunt and desperate. Everyone could feel that something was wrong, though they rarely said it aloud. Among the passengers, there were stories hidden behind faces, each one carrying private grief or desire. A man in a brown coat read a folded newspaper, shaking his head at the reports of unrest. Across from him, another dozed with a hand on his bag, guarding it even in sleep. The mother held her child tighter as the train jolted, her lips moving in silent prayers. And then there was the boy. No one knew much about him, not where he came from, nor where he was headed. His clothes were plain, but not ragged, his hair brushed, but slightly undone from the dampness in the air. He looked like a boy caught between two worlds, not quite poor, not quite privileged. Something about his quietness made him easy to overlook, but silence often hides what noise cannot. There were already signs of unease, if one cared to notice. The way the man in the brown coat kept glancing at the boy as though measuring him. The way the boy stirred in his half-sleep, his face twitching at dreams that seemed darker than a child should carry. The way the train itself seemed to grow colder as it pushed further into the night. These were small things, subtle, yet together they created a weight in the air, a warning of sorts, though no one had the language to name it. Life for the boy before the train had not been simple. He came from a house where warmth was scarce even when the hearth burned. His father worked in trade, often gone for long stretches, and his mother spoke little, her voice clipped with weariness. The boy had learned early how to keep quiet, how to avoid being noticed. He walked the streets like a shadow, watching others laugh or fight, but rarely joining in. His eyes were quick, his steps soft. People often forgot he was in the room until he moved, yet there was something restless in him, a hunger, not for food, but for something else, something larger. He watched the world with a sharpness that made him seem older than his years. He listened when men in taverns spoke of fortunes, of power, of how some could bend rules while others broke under them. He noticed how certain voices carried weight, how others trembled under command. These were not lessons a child should have to learn, but he carried them all the same. Those around him might have called him quiet, good, perhaps even well-mannered. But silence is not always peace. Beneath it, darker thoughts can grow. Resentment, longing, anger press down until it hardens. The boy carried those seeds, though no one saw them. Perhaps not even he understood them yet. The train gave him escape, at least for a while. The seats smelled of old wood and smoke, the windows streaked with mist. Outside, fields blurred by, their shapes dissolving in a shadow as night deepened. For the boy, it was a kind of cocoon, a place where no one asked anything of him, where no voice scolded or demanded. He could close his eyes and drift, imagining he was far away, someone else entirely. But the world does not allow such dreams for long. In the corner of the carriage, the man in the brown coat folded his newspaper with care, his eyes sliding again toward the boy. His lips pressed thin, his fin, jars tapping against the armrest. Something in his stillness felt heavy, as though he waited for the right moment. To the others, he was just another passenger. To the boy, though, he would soon become something else entirely. There's always a moment before things break, a quiet space where everything still appears normal, yet carries the crack beneath. This was that moment. The boy half asleep, the train carrying him forward, the night outside closing in. The other passengers breathed in rhythm with the engine's pulse, unaware that what seemed like just another journey was already slipping into something darker. The boy's chest rose and fell, his small hand curled against the seat. His dreams stirred with strange images, flashes of voices and faces he couldn't place. And when the train hissed and slowed, as though preparing to stop in a place unmarked on any schedule, he shifted in his sleep. No one saw his eyes twitch open for a second, or the faint trace of fear in them. Before he sank again into the pull of exhaustion, maybe by the time he woke fully, the world around him would not be the one he had left behind. And nothing, neither the boy, nor the man in the brown coat, nor those who later searched for answers, would ever be the same again. The boy woke with a jolt as the train lurched on the tracks. For a moment, he did not know where he was. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, the rhythm of the engine pounding like a heartbeat through the carriage. The other passengers seemed unchanged, though their faces carried a strange hardness he had not noticed before. The man in the brown coat was still there, seated across from him, though now his eyes seemed fixed too firmly, as if watching not just a boy, but something he meant to claim. The boy shifted in his seat, glancing out the window where only darkness pressed against the glass. He felt a prickling in his skin, the sense that something unseen had already reached for him. He tried to push it away, but unease clung like a shadow. His world had always been one of silence, but this silence felt different. It was not born of safety, but of something waiting. The man in the brown coat leaned slightly forward, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Long ride, isn't it?" His tone carried a calmness too smooth, like water hiding sharp stones beneath. The boy nodded, not trusting his voice. His upbringing had taught him not to offer words unless asked, not to show too much of himself. Still, he felt the man studying him, weighing him as one might weigh gold or secrets. That first exchange seemed simple, almost harmless. Yet it was the spark that began to stir something unseen. The man's interest did not fade. He asked where the boy came from, where he was headed, and if his parents waited for him at the next stop. Each question was soft, but they pressed deeper than they should have, and though the boy answered in clipped words, he knew he was giving away more than he wished. The man's smile tightened with each reply, as though he gathered invisible threads, weaving them into something he alone understood. The boy tried to look away, tried to retreat into the drifting quiet of his thoughts, but once words are spoken, they cannot be taken back. He felt trapped under the man's gaze, pinned as if on display. Others in the carriage seemed not to notice, or perhaps they chose not to. That was the way of the world. People often ignored what unsettled them. But to the boy, every moment under that watchful eye felt heavier, a weight pressing into his chest. Days before the train ride, life had already begun to unravel in ways too subtle for him to grasp. His father had returned home after weeks away, his temper sharp, his words harsher than usual. There had been whispers of debts owed, of business ventures gone wrong, though the boy had only overheard fragments. His mother's silence had grown heavier, her eyes darting away whenever questions were asked. There was a sense of something collapsing within those walls, though no one dared name it aloud. For the boy, the train had been a small reprieve, a chance to escape the tension that hung in his house like smoke. But now it seemed he had carried that weight with him, only to find it mirrored in the gaze of a stranger. The man in the brown coat had his own shadows. He had once been respected in his circle, a man trusted with other men's money, their faith placed in his careful dealings. But respect has a way of slipping, and when one misstep grows into many, even the strongest mask begins to crack. He had debts too, ones heavier than the boy could imagine. There were whispers behind his back, and though he kept his posture straight, his heart burned with bitterness. Power was slipping through his fingers, and he searched desperately for a way to seize it again. That search had led him onto this train, though no one yet knew what he intended to take from it. The boy's silence only seemed to sharpen the man's interest. Where others might have turned away, he leaned closer. "You've got sharp eyes," he said softly. "You see more than you let on, don't you?" It was less a question than a statement, and though the boy shifted uncomfortably, he did not answer. Deep down, he knew it was true. He had always noticed things others missed. But to have a stranger see that in him felt unsettling, like being stripped bare. That night stretched longer than it should have, each mile carrying not relief but unease. At one point, the mother and child left the carriage at a small station, their absence making the space feel emptier, quieter. The man took the vacant seat beside the boy, the closeness of him filling the boy with dread. He smelled faintly of tobacco and damp earth, his sleeve brushing the boy's as though by accident. The boy clenched his hands together, staring out the window, counting the passing moments he might have ended there, with only discomfort, if not for what lay hidden beneath both their lives. For the boy, it was the tension at home, the arguments, the suspicion that his father's dealings had placed him in danger. For the man, it was desperation, debts that had grown teeth, men waiting to collect what he could not give. Those separate worlds began to knot together, the threads tightening with each mile. Over the next hours, words between them grew heavier. The man began to speak of opportunity, of choices that could change a life. "You're young," he said, his voice low. "You don't yet know what the world can give to those who dare take it." The boy listened despite himself, drawn in by the cadence more than the meaning. But behind the smoothness of those words was something darker, an invitation, a test. The boy felt torn. Part of him wanted to retreat, to keep silent, to escape this man whose presence unsettled him. But another part, something restless, hungry, wounded by the coldness of his own home, leaned toward the idea that maybe there was something more, something waiting if he dared to reach for it. That inner war was not visible on his face, but it burned inside him, a fire he could neither name nor extinguish. Outside pressures sharpened the moment. The world of 1847 was merciless to those who hesitated. Children grew into laborers overnight. Men broke under debts, and women endured silence and shadows. Choices were rarely fair, and survival often meant crossing lines one never thought they would. The boy had felt those lines pressing on him long before the train, though he could not have explained them. Now, in the presence of this man, those lines blurred, the space between right and wrong narrowing until it seemed like a single breath could tip him either way. As the train slowed near another nameless station, the man's hand rested briefly on the boy's shoulder, firm enough to still him. "Stay," he said, almost in a whisper. "There are things worth seeing if you know where to look." The boy's chest tightened, his heart hammering. He could have pulled away, could have stood and left. But he didn't. The moment passed in silence, the train pulling forward again into the darkness. And with it, the boy's chance at escape slipped further. Behind them, in towns and cities, lives tangled with theirs. The boy's father faced men who no longer asked politely for repayment. His mother sat alone, wringing her hands as the fire died low, knowing something had already gone wrong, though she could not yet name it. For the man in the brown coat, shadows waited as well. Creditors sharpening their patience into violence, secrets he could no longer hide. All of it pressed inward, circling closer, until this meeting on the train became more than chance. The boy began to feel the pull of the man's words even when he wanted to resist. He felt himself being drawn into a story not of his own making, one where he was both pawn and witness. The unease grew sharper with each passing hour, not only between them, but inside him, as though he carried both fear and fascination in equal measure. The night deepened. The train roared forward, and in that long stretch of hours, something fragile inside the boy shifted. The silence he had carried for years began to crack, letting in voices that promised more than safety, more than home. By the time the carriage emptied further, by the time only shadows remained with them, it was clear that the path they had stepped on it could not lead anywhere but toward darkness. The train had grown quieter as the night deepened, the rhythm of its wheels carrying a hypnotic beat that seemed to echo inside the boy's chest. Only a few lamps flickered along the carriage walls, their glow trembling with every jolt of the track. Outside, there was nothing but blackness and the occasional blur of trees that appeared and vanished like ghosts. The boy sat rigid now, no longer drifting into sleep. He felt the man in the brown coat beside him, too close, his presence heavy in the air. Every movement, every word, every breath seemed sharpened to a point, as if the world itself had narrowed down to this single S. Stretch of night. The man leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady, though edged with something sharp. You don't belong where you came from, do you? I can see it in your eyes. You're wasted there. His words carried both lure and threat, and the boy felt his stomach tighten. He did not answer, but his silence only seemed to encourage the man. A hand settled briefly on the boy's wrist, not harsh, but claiming, a touch that made his skin crawl. He pulled away, his heart pounding, and for the first time his eyes flashed with resistance. That flicker of defiance shifted something in the air. The man's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as though the boy's refusal had scratched something raw inside him. Beneath the calm mask was a man who had been stripped of power too many times, who could not bear another rejection, even from child. His hand returned, this time firmer, fingers digging into the boy's arm. Don't turn from me, he whispered, though his voice was no longer smooth. It carried a crack, the sound of something breaking. The boy struggled, twisting in his seat, his breath quickening. The carriage was nearly empty. Only a single older man dozing at the far end, his head slumped against the window. No one saw, or, if they did not wish to. The boy's voice caught in his throat, the instinct to cry out smothered by fear. His pulse hammered in his ears as the man pulled him closer, their faces inches apart. And then, in the small space between heartbeats, everything broke open. The boy shoved back with sudden force, panic giving him strength he did not know he had. His elbow struck the man's chest, knocking him off balance. The man snarled, his composure gone, and his hand shot to the boy's throat. The world narrowed to pressure and breath. The boy choking, gasping, the man's eyes wild with a fury born of humiliation, desperation, and something far darker. The struggle was raw and clumsy, not a clean act, but a storm of limbs and gasps and terror. The boy's nails scraped against the man's hand, his legs kicking against the wooden seat. The lamp above them swung with emotion, casting frantic shadows that made the scene look like a nightmare come alive. The boy thought of his father's anger, his mother's silence, the weight of being unseen. He thought of how close death now pressed against him, and with a last burst of strength, he reached blindly. His hand closed around something cold and heavy. The small metal hammer the train workers sometimes left for repairs. In one desperate motion, he swung. The sound was sickening, a dull crack that seemed to echo louder than the train itself. The man jerked, his grip loosening as shock crossed his face. Blood welled at his temple, dark against the flickering light. For a breath, time froze. The boy's chest heaved, his eyes wide, and the man stared at him as though unable to believe what had happened. But panic dries hands before the mind can think. The boy struck again, wild and trembling, the hammer falling with brutal force. Once, twice, 3 times. The man collapsed against the seat, his body twitching before going slack, his eyes glassy and unseeing. Blood spread quickly, seeping into the cracks of the wooden bench, dripping onto the floor. The smell of iron filled the air, sharp and heavy. The boy dropped the hammer, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His ears rang with the sound of the strikes, replaying over and over, refusing to fade. He stared at the man's body, the ruin of it, the blood that now stained his own skin. A part of him wanted to scream, to claw his way out of the train, but his voice was locked inside him. All he could do was sit there, chest heaving, staring at what he had done to T, the far end of the carriage, the older man stirred, shifting slightly but not waking. Relief and terror crashed together in the boy's chest. No one had seen, at least not yet. But the scene was undeniable, impossible to hide for long. His mind raced with frantic thoughts. What if someone entered? What if they saw the blood? What if they knew? The boy pulled himself to his feet, his knees trembling so badly he nearly collapsed again. He grabbed at the man's coat, as if moving him could undo what had been done. The body was heavy, dead weight, blood soaking in a fabric that smeared onto the boy's hands. He tried to drag it toward the corner, away from view, but the effort was hopeless. His arms shook, his strength failing. The corpse slumped, legs jutting out unnaturally, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Denial crept in then, a voice whispering that maybe the man wasn't dead, that maybe he would wake and this nightmare would vanish. The boy pressed trembling fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse, for any sign of life. There was none. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady, indifferent rhythm of the train wheels carrying them forward. His heart raced with thoughts he could not control. What would they say when they found him? A boy, covered in blood, is standing over a man's body. Would they believe it had been self-defense? Would anyone listen? Or would they see only a murderer, a child no better than a beast? The world was not kind to those without power, and he had none. He sat back down, clutching his knees to his chest, rocking slightly as tears burned his eyes. The hammer lay on the floor, slick with blood, glinting faintly in the lamplight. He could not bring himself to touch it again. His breath came in short, broken bursts as he tried to swallow the reality pressing down on him. He had not meant for this to happen. He had only wanted to be free of the man's grip, free of the fear that had closed around him. Yet freedom had come at a cost that felt unbearable. Minutes stretched into hours. Every sound of the train became a threat. The groan of the wheels, the whistle in the distance, the shifting of the older passenger at the far end. The boy imagined eyes turning toward him, hands reaching, voices shouting. His mind raced with ways to explain, ways to hide, ways to undo what had already been carved into the night. But nothing came. The truth sat there in front of him, silent and bloody, impossible to erase, that by the time the train slowed toward the next station, the boy was trembling so violently he could barely remain upright. The lamps flickered once more, casting the body into strange shapes, making it seem as though it might rise again. He wanted to flee, to throw himself into the night and never be seen again. But his legs would not move, and his mind could not decide which was worse, to run and be hunted, or to stay and face the weight of what he had done. The train screeched to a halt, and footsteps echoed outside on the platform. Voices carried, faint at first, then closer. The boy's chest constricted, his breath caught in his throat. The door would open, and with it, everything would unravel. The moment of violence, born in panic and fear, had already sealed his fate. And as the footsteps approached, he realized that nothing in his life, from the silence of his childhood to the terror of this night, had prepared him for W. How was about to come? The station lamps threw pale light across the platform as the train screeched to a halt. Doors swung open, voices spilled in, footsteps thudded on the wooden planks. The boy sat frozen in his seat, his breath shallow, his clothes stained dark. The body beside him lay slumped, its blood pooling slowly across the floorboards, soaking into the cracks. For a moment, no one noticed. Passengers climbed aboard, muttering about the late hour, adjusting their coats, and finding places to sit. The boy felt the air thicken around him, every sound sharper than it should have been. He waited for the moment when eyes would turn, when someone would see, when everything would collapse. The IT did not take long. A woman gasped first, her hand flying to her mouth as she spotted the figure slumped unnaturally against the seat. Then another voice cried out. Within seconds, the quiet carriage turned frantic. Men rushed forward, calling for help, their boots striking the wooden floor in uneven rhythm. The boy remained where he was, trembling, as though nailed to the seat. His hands, sticky with blood, clutched at his knees. He could not speak. He could not explain. He could only watch as strangers crowded the body, their faces twisting in horror and confusion. When they finally saw him, their shock turned sharper. A child, his face pale, his clothes marked with crimson. Questions fired at him. What happened? Who did this? But his mouth refused to move. His silence, once his shield, now condemns him. A man grabbed his arm roughly, dragging him upright. The boy stumbled, nearly falling, his eyes darting everywhere for escape. But there was none. The world had closed in around him. Word spread quickly. By the time the authorities arrived, the station was buzzing with voices. Some whispered in pity, others in outrage. A boy was too small to kill a grown man, they said. It must have been an accident, or perhaps he had been driven to it. Others muttered darker suspicions. Evil can show itself early, and perhaps the boy carried it in him. Every voice seemed to weigh him down, building a picture of him before he had spoken a word. When the constables led him away, he did not resist. His legs carried him forward, though his mind lagged, stuck in a moment of impact, in the hammer's sickening sound, in the look on the man's face as life drained from it. He replayed it endlessly, wishing for a different ending, begging silently for the strike to have never landed. But wishing could not undo blood that ached the station house. He was questioned. The room was cold, the wooden table scarred by years of use. Men leaned in close, demanding answers. Why had he done it? Did he plan it? Did someone help him? The boy stammered at first, then fell back into silence. He wanted to say he had been afraid, that the man's hands had stolen his breath, that he had only wanted to break free. But the words stuck in his throat. He had spent years swallowing his voice at home, and now, when it mattered most, it betrayed him again. His silence looked like guilt. Outside those walls, his family faced their own storm. His father raged at the shame, his pride torn apart by the whispers that his son was a killer. His mother wept quietly, unable to reconcile the image of her quiet boy with the act described in the papers. Neighbors stared when they passed, some with pity, others with disgust. The family's name, once spoken plainly, now carried weight, suspicion, and stigma. The boy sat alone in his cell at night, his knees pulled tight to his chest. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it brought nightmares. Blood spreading across the train floor, the man's eyes wide and unblinking, the sound of iron striking bone. He woke gasping, the walls pressing close, the darkness too heavy to bear. Guilt gnawed at him, but so did confusion. Was he a murderer, or simply a boy who had defended himself? Was there a difference? The world outside seemed certain of its answer, yet inside him the question tore him apart. The newspapers turned the story into a spectacle. Some wrote of a tragedy, a child pushed beyond his limits by the grasp of a dangerous man. Others painted him as a monster, proof of decay in a society that let boys wander too freely. Every article, every line twisted the truth further, until the boy himself no longer knew where his story ended and theirs began. Strangers who had never seen his face debated his fate as though it were entertainment. In town, the community fractured. Some whispered that the man in the brown coat had not been as respectable as he seemed, that debts and darkness followed him. Others refused to hear it, insisting his death was a crime against decency itself. The boy became a mirror for their fears, their anger, their hunger for justice. Few saw him as child. Most saw him only as a symbol of danger, of corruption, of punishment yet to come. For his mother, the weight was unbearable. She visited him once, sitting across from him in the cold room, her hands trembling as she tried to reach for his. He did not meet her eyes. Shame burned too deeply in him. When she finally whispered, "Why, my son?" he had no answer. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and the silence between them grew so heavy it seemed to swallow the air. She left without another word, her figure small as she disappeared down the corridor. The boy's father never came. Pride would not allow it. Instead, he spoke to others of betrayal, of weakness, as though his son's act was an insult to him personally. The boy heard whispers of it, and each one cut deeper than the last. He had killed a man, but somehow it was his father's anger that made him feel condemned beyond repair. Weeks passed. The trial loomed. The boy felt the walls closing tighter, each day marked not by hope, but by dread. He thought often of the night on the train, replaying it not as a single act, but as the chain of moments that had led there. The man's hand on his wrist, the press of fingers at his throat, the blur of panic. Sometimes, he convinced himself he had no choice. Other times, he drowned in guilt, certain he had gone too far, that he had become the very thing he feared. Both truths lived inside him, and neither gave him peace. The community, too, wrestled with its conscience. Some demanded harsh punishment to set an example. Others whispered of mercy, of the unfairness of judging a boy as though he were grown. The court would decide, but long before the verdict, he had already been judged in the eyes of many. The boy felt it, even in his cell, the weight of voices he could not hear but knew were speaking of him, defining him, sealing him into a story he could not escape. And in the quietest hours, when all voices fell away, the boy faced the only one that mattered, his owl. And he whispered apologies into the darkness, to the man he had struck, to the mother who had wept, to the life that now lay in ruins. His words dissolved into the stone walls, unheard, unanswered. He carried them anyway, heavy and unrelenting, a burden he would never put down. The crime had not ended on that train. It lived on in every whispered word, every headline, every look cast his way. It lived in the silence of his home, in the weeping of his mother, in the rage of his father. It lived in him, twisting his sleep, haunting his days. The blow of the hammer had been the climax, but its echoes would stretch far beyond that night, rippling outward through lives and reputations, through guilt and judgment, through a boy who had wanted only to be free and had instead bound himself forever to a moment of blood. The courtroom was filled with an unsettling quiet when the verdict was finally read. William Caldwell, the boy who had once been dismissed as a wanderer of strange stories, now sat in shackles, his head bowed as if the weight of time itself had collapsed onto his shoulders. The jury's decision sealed his fate. Guilty of murder, guilty of betrayal, guilty of tearing apart not only one life, but an entire community's sense of trust. The law had spoken, and justice, in its cold and rigid form, was delivered. But as the gavel struck, a question hung heavy in the air. Had justice truly been served, or had the truth been swallowed by fear, influence, and the raw hunger for control? For the Caldwell family, the name they had carried with pride was now poisoned. Their wealth, which had once given them power, could not shield them from shame. Neighbors who once smiled at their doorstep now turned their backs in silence. The whispers followed them everywhere, at the market, at church, even in the streets where their carriages once rolled with confidence. For Elizabeth, William's younger sister, life was split in two. Before the crime, when her brother was her protector, and after, when he became a figure of dread. She carried the weight of it quietly, watching her family's home grow darker, more hollow, as though its very walls recoiled from the truth. The family of Margaret, too, bore wounds that could not be seen, but were far deeper than any scar. Her mother, who had once been proud of her daughter's sharp wit and quiet grace, could no longer step outside without hearing Margaret's name dragged through speculation. Friends became strangers, offering empty condolences, then retreating into gossip the moment her back was turned. Margaret's father, who had built his life on integrity and hard work, now carried the unbearable regret of having trusted the wrong family. His grief grew sharper each time he passed the train station, the place where his daughter's story began and ended. In every corner of their home, Margaret's presence lingered like a ghost, a reminder of the innocence stolen by violence. The newspapers wrote their stories with hunger, spinning tragedy into spectacle. The boy who slept on a train and woke up in another century. One headline screamed, painting William as a figure both monstrous and mysterious. Reporters clawed at every detail, from his strange claims of waking in a world not his own to his cold actions on that fateful night. Some wrote of him as a criminal mind, others as a tragic soul undone by secrets too heavy for a boy. His age, public opinion swayed back and forth. Was he a villain, or was he another victim of a society that turned its face away from uncomfortable truths? Each article only deepened the divide, as readers clung to whichever version suited their fears or prejudices. Behind the ink and headlines, though, lay the quieter, more devastating truth. The crime had shaken the very fabric of their community. Trust, once taken for granted, became fragile. Parents looked at their children differently, with sharper eyes and heavier rules. Friendships grew strained, marriages faltered, and even the simple comfort of stepping onto a train became layered with unease. People no longer saw railways as the promise of progress, but as a reminder of how quickly the journey of one life could be stolen. What had once been seen as a path to opportunity now carried the echo of Margaret's final night. In prison, William wrestled with the slow decay of time. His bravado, which once gave him the power to manipulate, crumbled under the endless silence of the cell. Some nights he replayed every moment, every choice, until the walls closed in with unbearable weight. Another night, he told himself it had been destiny, that he had been thrown into a century not his own, forced to survive in a world that would never understand him. Whether these words were truth or madness became impossible to tell. What was certain, though, was that he was no longer the boy on the train. He was a man carved by guilt, by regret, and by the sharp edges of his own choices. The broader world drew its own lessons from the tragedy. Lawmakers debated what it meant for crimes committed by those barely grown, asking whether a boy could ever fully understand the blood on his hands. The case was studied in whispers at universities, dissected in sermons from pulpits, and used as a warning to children who dared defy their parents. Some argued the crime showed the dangers of wealth, that power, when unchecked, bred arrogance and cruelty. Others claimed it was proof of human weakness, a reminder that darkness could grow in anyone, no matter their upbringing. The truth, as always, was more complicated, lying somewhere between the failings of individuals and the failings of the world around them. To its heart, the story was not just about a boy and a girl, not just about one act of violence on a cold night. It was about the fragile balance of trust and power, the way small choices ripple outward until they become storms. It was about how love, when twisted by jealousy and control, can turn into a weapon sharper than any blade. And it was about the way society itself often fails to see the cracks until it is too late, until a tragedy forces everyone to face what has been hiding in plain sight. Years later, when the train tracks still carried passengers through the countryside, older travelers would lower their voices as they passed a stretch where Margaret was last seen. They would speak of the boy who boarded a train and woke up in another century, a boy who became a murderer, a boy whose story blurred the lines between myth and truth. Some told it as a cautionary tale, others as a mystery never fully solved. But for the families left behind, there was nothing mythical about it. Their grief was as real as the iron rails, their loss as endless as the horizon. Those rails disappeared into in the end. Justice came in the form of punishment, but it could never restore what was taken. Margaret's laughter, her future, her very being, remained lost to time. William's life, too, was consumed, not by the century he claimed to come from, but by the century he could never escape. The story left behind was one of pain, yes, but also of warning. It asked hard questions about power, about the price of silence, and about the fragile line between love and possession. And it left those who heard it with an uneasy truth, that beneath the surface of every life, no matter how ordinary it may seem, lies the possibility of darkness waiting to be woken.